On the morning of May 10, 1775, Lake Champlain lay completely silent beneath a freezing, dark sky. From the Vermont shore, 83 militia men quietly pushed their boats into the freezing water. Every stroke of the oar carried them closer to a fortified British garrison across the lake. Ahead stood Fort Ticonderoga, a crumbling stone fortress that controlled the most strategic waterway in North America. Only a single sentry stood guard at the fort's southern gate that morning. The column closed the distance before the alarm could spread across the garrison. The sentry pulled the trigger. The musket misfired and produced no shot. He turned and fled inside, shouting warning to a garrison that barely stirred. The attackers poured through the entrance before any organized defense could form. British soldiers stumbled from their bunks into a courtyard already full of armed men. At the head of the attack was Ethan Allen, moving directly toward the commander's quarters. A British officer, barely awake, opened his door to a drawn sword pointed at his face. The demand was immediate and unambiguous. Surrender the fort at once. The officer asked, "By what authority?" A reasonable question with no clean answer. Allen declared, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." At that same hour, the Continental Congress was convening in Philadelphia for the first time. No order authorizing the raid had been written or sent. Other witnesses recalled far rougher words. "Come out of there, you old rat." Captain William Delaplace, the fort's commanding officer, emerged to assess what faced him. Facing an armed occupation and no prepared defense, Delaplace surrendered. One American received a minor bayonet wound. No soldier on either side was killed. The engagement lasted roughly 10 minutes. The fortress was taken. Inside the walls sat nearly 60 pieces of artillery the Continental Army desperately needed. The first offensive victory of the American Revolutionary War was complete. The man who secured it held no commission and carried no authorization from any government. Ethan Allen was born in 1738 in Litchfield, Connecticut, the eldest of 8 children. His father intended to prepare him for Yale College and invested in his education. When his father Joseph Allen died in 1755, those plans ended permanently. At 17, Allen returned home to manage family affairs and pursued farming without lasting success. He attempted iron production and mining ventures, but none secured financial stability. He briefly served during the French and Indian War, though no notable distinction was recorded. In the 1760s, Allen moved into the territory known as the New Hampshire Grants. Settlers there had purchased land titles issued by the governor of New Hampshire in good faith. In 1764, King George III ruled in favor of New York's competing land claim. New York surveyors arrived and demanded settlers repay for land already cleared and farmed. Some families were told to relinquish farms they had worked for a decade. In 1770, settlers gathered at the Catamount Tavern in Bennington to organize a response. That meeting produced a militia. Allen was elected Colonel Commandant of the Green Mountain Boys. The Green Mountain Boys tore down survey markers and expelled New York officials from the region. In 1771, Governor William Tryon declared Allen an outlaw with a 20-pound bounty. By 1774, the bounty had risen to 100 pounds, a significant sum by colonial standards. Allen responded by posting a counter-bounty on New York officials. On April 19, 1775, fighting erupted at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. News of the fighting reached the New Hampshire Grants within days. Fort Ticonderoga controlled the water corridor linking Canada to the Hudson River Valley. The French built it in 1755 as Fort Carillon, a major military installation on the continent. In 1758, French forces repelled a far larger British army in one of the bloodiest battles in North American history. The British captured it in 1759, renamed it Ticonderoga, and garrisoned it permanently. By 1775, the fort was in serious structural decay, neglected throughout the peacetime decade. The garrison held only 2 officers and approximately 46 soldiers, many unfit for field service. Around 25 women and children also lived within the fort's walls. Despite its decay, The fort stored nearly 60 pieces of heavy artillery. The colonial forces surrounding Boston had almost no heavy guns to break the British position. Benedict Arnold, a Connecticut militia officer, independently recognized the artillery at Ticonderoga. The Massachusetts Committee of Safety commissioned Arnold as colonel to seize Ticonderoga. Arnold rode north immediately, pushing his horse to the limit across rough colonial roads. His horse reportedly collapsed from exhaustion during the journey north. On May 9, 1775, he arrived at Castleton, Vermont, to find Allen already assembling 150 men. Arnold presented his formal commission and demanded command of the entire expedition. The Green Mountain Boys refused. They would follow Allen or leave the expedition entirely. A compromise was reached. They would go side by side at the head of the column. That evening, the men gathered at the Remington Tavern to make final preparations. They drank a mixture called the Stone Fence, made from rum and hard cider. The plan required crossing Lake Champlain under cover of darkness before dawn arrived. When the boats arrived late, there were far fewer than needed for the full force. Only 83 men could cross in the first attempt. Allen chose not to wait. They rowed across Lake Champlain in silence, with no artillery and no backup plan. If a sentry spotted the boats on the water, 83 men in rowboats would have been sitting targets. They landed as the first gray light of dawn appeared above the eastern treeline. The sentry at the gate spotted them. He raised his musket and fired. The musket misfired. No shot discharged. The moment of surprise held. Allen charged through the entrance immediately, column close behind him. British soldiers were seized from their bunks before any organized resistance formed. Lieutenant Jocelyn Feltham, second in command, emerged partially dressed at the top of the staircase. Allen demanded the surrender of the fort. Feltham demanded to know by what authority. He answered, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." Captain William Delaplace appeared moments later, now dressed, examining the situation below. Facing armed men and no organized defense, he ordered his garrison paraded without arms. The garrison surrendered. The engagement had lasted approximately 10 minutes. Not a single person was killed. The first offensive American victory was complete. As more men crossed the lake, they searched the fort thoroughly for supplies. They discovered approximately 90 gallons of rum belonging to Captain Delaplace. By noon, all 90 gallons had been consumed. The fort's discipline had collapsed entirely. Allen later wrote that the liquor was taken for the refreshment of the fatigued soldiery. Benedict Arnold filed a formal complaint, describing the scene as disorder and deliberate plundering. Arnold wrote that Allen was a proper man to head his own wild people, but entirely unacquainted with military service. Days later, Fort Crown Point was also seized, with additional artillery falling into Patriot hands. The entire Lake Champlain corridor shifted into American control within days. The artillery still sat in an isolated fort. General George Washington needed a solution. Washington assigned the task to Colonel Henry Knox, a 25-year-old bookseller from Boston. Knox arrived at the fort in November 1775 and selected 59 cannons, mortars, and howitzers. The guns were loaded onto 42 heavy sleds constructed specifically for this operation. 80 yoke of oxen were hitched to pull a total cargo weight approaching 120,000 pounds. The route began with a 40-mile trek south across frozen Lake George. The ice was thick enough to be dangerous but not always strong enough to bear a cannon's weight. Each sled team carried an axe to cut lines before a cannon could drag oxen under the surface. The route continued through the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts in deep snow. Knox later wrote to Washington, "It was not easy to conceive the difficulties we have had. Towns along the route supplied additional men, oxen, and food the column could not have managed without." In January 1776, after 10 weeks, Knox delivered every gun to Washington's camp outside Boston. Washington had waited months for this moment. Not a single cannon had been lost. On the night of March 4, 1776, Washington ordered the guns moved to Dorchester Heights. American soldiers worked through the night to position and fortify the artillery above the city. When British commanders looked up the next morning, they saw heavy artillery aimed directly at their fleet. The harbor fleet lay fully within range. The city could not be defended against those heights. On March 17, 1776, the British began evacuating Boston entirely. Approximately 11,000 British troops and Loyalist civilians left the city without a direct battle. It was Washington's first major strategic victory of the entire Revolutionary War. The guns that cleared Boston had been sitting in a neglected fort months earlier, guarded by 46 soldiers. Despite the celebrated victory, regimental command went to Allen's cousin Seth Warner, not Allen. Allen joined the American invasion of Canada in 1775 as a volunteer, without formal command. In September 1775, he led an unauthorized attack on Montreal with about 100 men. The second force expected to strike simultaneously never appeared. Allen was surrounded and captured by British troops on September 25, 1775. He spent approximately 2.5 years in British custody on prison ships. He was transported to England, then moved through prison facilities in New York City. British authorities considered charging Allen with treason but feared creating a martyr. In May 1778, he was exchanged for British Colonel Archibald Campbell. After release, Allen returned to Vermont and campaigned vigorously for its independence. Ethan Allen died in February 1789 at age 51, 2 years before Vermont joined the Union. No confirmed portrait of Allen made during his lifetime has ever been verified. Later statues were modeled from family resemblance rather than a verified likeness of Allen himself. In 1777, British General John Burgoyne advanced south from Canada with nearly 8,000 men. American forces held the fort but had left the surrounding high ground unfortified. The British began cutting a road up Sugar Loaf Hill, directly overlooking the fort. British Major General Phillips reportedly declared, "Where a goat can go, a man can go, and where a man can go, he can drag a gun." When Americans spotted British artillery above them on Sugar Loaf Hill, the position was untenable. American General Arthur St. Clair ordered immediate evacuation. The fort was abandoned without battle. Burgoyne occupied Ticonderoga, but his campaign south ended in disaster. Burgoyne's army was defeated and surrendered at Saratoga, a decisive turning point in the war. Fort Ticonderoga stands today on the shore of Lake Champlain, restored as a public museum. Its cannons have long since scattered across the battlefields of the Revolution. The entire operation originated from a land dispute settled in tavern meetings, not from any government order. The Continental Congress had not ordered it. Washington had not directed it. A tavern plan led to a lake crossing, a winter march, and artillery placed above Boston Harbor. The journey from fort to battlefield covered 300 miles through some of the worst winter conditions on the continent. The guns were in place on Dorchester Heights before the British realized what was happening. On March 17, 1776, 11,000 British troops left Boston permanently, without a single direct engagement. The chain linked a midnight raid to a strategic evacuation that gave the Revolution its first real momentum. That momentum carried the war forward through years of hardship to British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. Everything turned on a musket that misfired in the pre-dawn dark of May 10, 1775. A sword raised in a corridor, and a blunt demand for surrender, secured the artillery that mattered. Henry Knox left track marks across frozen lakes that connected Ticonderoga to the siege of Boston. The five-pointed fort that once bristled with defenders had fallen to 83 men without a battle. Benedict Arnold left Ticonderoga frustrated, but his road forward would define his later reputation entirely. The water route from Canada to New York City ran through this lake. Whoever held it controlled the continent's corridor. The Green Mountain Boys had formed to fight over land titles, not liberty. They changed history anyway. The lake looks today much as it did when 83 men crossed it before dawn and altered the course of a war. The fort fell because someone showed up uninvited, before dawn, with 83 men and a misfired musket on his side. The Continental Congress had not ordered it. No general had planned it. but the fort fell, and the war turned with it.